Hi everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and today, super exciting, we can finally talk about the performance numbers of AMD's second generation Ryzen Threadripper CPUs. So today I'll be covering the 16-core Ryzen Threadripper 2950WX, and also on the right there you can see the 32-core Threadripper 2990WX. I'll be benchmarking both of those today. I've spent pretty much the last 3 or 4 days benchmarking these, plus a load of Intel CPUs as well. So without further ado, let's take a look at the performance numbers. Right then, so first up in the numbers, I've been delving into some workstation applications, and so start with then, there's POV-Ray, where I used the built-in benchmark to simulate a workload here. And as you can see, the 2990WX with its 32 cores is absolutely awesome in this benchmark. You're looking at a huge amount faster than the Core i9-7980XE, despite the fact that the latter actually costs a couple of $100 more at the moment. You can actually pre-order the 2990WX for less than $1,800. Which is, well, it's an absolute steal if you're into workstation workloads. The 2950X does a reasonable job, given the fact that it's half the price of the Intel 18-core CPU. You're looking at just two seconds difference here, which in the overall scheme of things is just like a couple of percent really. That's at stock speed. Overclocked, the 2990WX, I managed to hit 4.1 gigahertz on sustained workloads here. Gets pretty toasty, but that was enough to drop that time in POV-Ray from 26 seconds to 22 seconds, and pretty much the same lead, around a third faster than the Core i9-7980XE. And when overclocked, the Intel CPU was at a much higher frequency as well. So overall then, a resounding win for AMD there. It beats the Intel convincingly with its flagship CPU, and also the 299050X, both much better value than the Intel 18-core, and far better value here than the Core i9-7900X, which retails for a similar price, and is even slower. I think you're looking at right at the bottom of the graph there, 64 seconds it took to finish the benchmark. The 2950X managed it in just 41 seconds. So be under no illusions there, AMD is absolutely owning it in POV-Ray there, both in terms of performance and price. So moving on to Cinebench then, the multi-core benchmark, and once again then the 2990WX, the benchmark is able to tap into all those 32 cores and 64 threads, eking out a huge lead, nearly 2,000 points faster when at stock speed, 5,120 versus 3,299 for the Intel Core i9-7980XE. So that is a huge lead, and I managed to overclock the 2990WX to 4.1 gigahertz, as I mentioned earlier, and that's also had a big impact on the score here. So about 1,000 point improvement in Cinebench just by overclocking, and I managed to get the 7980XE to about 4.5 gigahertz, I think, and yeah, a sizable performance. You know, again, a thousand point increase there. That's actually larger in percentage terms, thanks to that that massive overclock compared to its base clock frequency, or base frequency, should I say. But still, it can't get anywhere near the AMD CPU. It's nearly a near 2,000 point difference. Again, moving on down the graph, 2950X Threadripper, 16 cores, actually practically able to match the 18-core Intel CPU. The Intel CPU is able to eke out quite a big lead when overclocked. I managed to get 4.2 gigahertz out of the 2950X, but the fact it's got a 2-core deficit there, Intel is able to eke out a lead once overclocked. So again, in terms of value, there's no comparison really. The Threadripper CPU is half the price of the 18-core Intel CPUs. So if you're at all concerned about value, AMD is also, extremely strong in Cinebench. Moving on to the single-core Cinebench test now, and we're looking at some pretty good performance numbers from Intel here. It's always very strong where single core performance is concerned, but as we saw with Ryzen's second generation, the better boosting algorithms, Precision Boost 2 and XFR 2, that kind of thing, you're seeing a real uplift in single core performance here. So what we've got is a stock speed score of 179, and that's only 2 points less than the 7900X. So that's a absolutely brilliant result there for AMD, really. And you can see the uplift that over the previous generation Threadripper, the 1950X, which is the previous 16-core, you're looking at, what, 15 points there, which is a significant amount when it comes to the single-core performance. So yes, it's a win for Intel, but AMD has made up some massive gains since last generation. And finally then, Blender with the benchmark add-on. Again, a time test like the POV-Ray, so seconds, the results are in seconds, and lower is better here. The 2990WX, again ruling supreme. It's nearly 10 seconds faster in just a very, very quick benchmark than the Core i9 7980XE. And once overclocked, the Intel does rein in the 32-core Threadripper somewhat, but there's still a 5-second difference. And again, this is quite a short benchmark, so in percentage terms, that's still significant. The 2990-50X, again, is able to hold its own against the 7980XE. And what we're able to see here is that there's really very little difference, given that the Intel CPU costs twice the price. Once overclocked, then a bit more of a difference. You've got a 7-second lead by the Intel CPU, but again, that's still not enough to get close really to the flagship Threadripper. So next up, the 9250X, again, you can see there's a clear performance advantage from the first generation Threadripper to second generation. 3 seconds shaved off the stock speed time and 2 seconds shaved off the overclock time. And that leaves the Core i9 7900X in a bit of a precarious position here, because it costs the same price as the 16-core Threadripper, but you're looking at a much, much lower performance in the kind of workstation, multi-core, multi-threaded workstation workload. Moving on here then to the content creation benchmarks, and less favourable here, it has to be said, for the Threadripper 2990WX. Despite the fact it's got twice as many cores as the Threadripper 2950X, we're only seeing a couple of hundred points added to the benchmarks here, which isn't great news. You're not seeing the kind of value that you'd expect from spending that extra above the 2950X. AMD fairly strong here. Both the 2950X and 2990WX are faster than the Intel CPU. Specifically the Core i9 7980XE, although the latter is faster when overclocked. HandBrake, honestly, this one kind of confused me a little bit, because the 2990WX really didn't perform as well as it should have done here. Now, scaling in HandBrake is questionable above about 6 cores, I think, but I'm still seeing pretty good scaling. Well, some scaling at least, maybe not pretty good, but at least some scaling from Intel's 7900X, which of course has 10 cores, up to 18 cores of the 7980XE. You see the performance drop from 98 seconds all the way down to 68 seconds. So that's into percentage terms, that's a significant fall. Admittedly, you'd be expecting a bit more than that, given that you're going from 10 cores to 18 cores, but there's still reasonable scaling. You wouldn't be too disappointed with that if you're using the CPU for other stuff and you just dabble with HandBrake occasionally. Again, 2950X, not too far behind the 18-core Intel CPU, but just look at the 2990WX. It's actually slower than the 16-core Threadripper. So clearly some issues here then, probably with the way the CPU's configured internally, or with the just the software. It just doesn't like the way that the CPU is configured, or it's not able to take advantage of all those cores. Clearly, could even be an issue with Windows. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't had time to get to the bottom of that, but looking at the results for Adobe Premiere, it's clearly an issue with content creation and the amount of cores that the CPU has, or its internal configuration, as I've said before. You can read more about how it's configured in my fault review, of course, but the Adobe Premiere result, pretty poor for the 2990WX. It's looking at 230 seconds to deal with a few gigabytes of 4K video and rendering that, and even the fact that the 7900X, the Intel 10-core CPU, is faster, that kind of shows that there's clearly something very wrong here. And the Ryzen Threadripper 2950X, 148 seconds, which is a huge amount faster again than the 32-core Threadripper. The winner here, probably the best option if you're going for a Premiere and performance is your primary concern, is the Core i9 7980XE. A huge amount faster than anything AMD had at stock speed, and even quicker when overclocked. So let's move on to gaming, and what we're looking at here are some pretty good performance numbers for Intel, as we might expect. Anywhere that gaming performance is concerned and CPU performance comes into play, you're looking at Intel doing pretty well. Unigine Superposition, a somewhat synthetic CPU benchmark, but still sort of based on modern gaming technologies and effects. Top CPU here is the Core i9-7980XE, so clearly, core count, it does count for something given in this benchmark, given that the Core i9-7900X perform less, although there's very, very little difference between the top result and the bottom result here. But once again, the bottom result is the 2990WX. So Ashes of the Singularity, again, is a benchmark that generally likes more cores. We see pretty good scaling in this benchmark, moving from lower core 4, 6 and 8 core processors up to 10 and more. But again, the 2990WX with 32 cores is sitting at the bottom of the pile. So clearly, then it's there's something going on with this CPU. Whether it's having all those cores tied together and half of them not able to have direct access to the rest of the system. They're essentially compute cores, and they have to communicate via the other two dies in order to get access to the memory and PCIe buses. So maybe that's got something to do with it here. I'll talk about in a minute the impact that dropping that CPU down to 16 cores and disabling simultaneous multi-threading has. But probably the most worrying result, I think, for the 32-core Threadripper, the 2990WX, is the fact that you're seeing frame drops in traditionally GPU-bound benchmarks as well. So if you look at the Final Fantasy 15 benchmarks, pretty much every other CPU gets exactly the same. So it's essentially a 3D GPU limited benchmark. But the 2990WX is dropping frames here. So the reason for that, I've yet to investigate. I've literally had time to go through a whole bunch of benchmarks for Forbes and other places as well over the last few days. I haven't really had time to look into this. But anyway, moving on to Fallout 4, and again, the mostly GPU limited Fallout 4 is again dropping frames with the 2990WX. Overclocking did improve the situation somewhat, but there's still a big gap between it and even the Ryzen Threadripper 1950X. And Deus Ex, again, 2990WX last. The 2950X does a reasonable effort here against Intel. It's one of the games that does show some difference between AMD and Intel. But as I saw with the second generation Ryzen CPUs, AMD has made huge gains with precision boost here. You can see that in the difference between a lot of the CPUs here, but also with faster memory. I was using 3000 megahertz memory here, just so it's compatible with everything, and that's what I've been using with my Intel system as well. So it's only fair that I use the same memory across both systems. AMD does see much more of an improvement if you go for faster memory. And what I was seeing from the likes of the Ryzen 7 2700X is that if you use faster memory, there's pretty much no difference between AMD and Intel here. So that's gonna, you'll probably be looking at the low 60s in terms of the minimum frame rate here for the 2950X. So if you are gaming, it's probably going to be better going for faster memory. And finally, World of Tanks, you're looking at again a last place position for the 2990WX, but not too far off the other results here, mainly because this benchmark is so GPU focused and clearly not too concerned about CPU performance. Finally then, power consumption. Stock speed, not too much to worry about. The fact that the 2990WX draws or at least has a TDP of 250 watts isn't too concerning. My 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler dealt with that quite easily, even when it was overclocked. Well, we'll get to overclocking in a minute. But stock speed, 2990WX drew 368 watts from the wall, so that's for the system, not just the CPU. And that's only a little bit more than the 18-core Intel Core i9-7980XE. So stock speed, you're only going to be needing a 500 or 600 watt power supply to deal with these CPUs. If you're overclocking though, you're going to need to have something a lot more powerful. The 2990WX, when overclocked, now admittedly this was a fairly high overclock. I managed to get it to 4.1 gigahertz using 1.4 volts, I believe. And that is kind of pushing the limits of the cooling and the processor, because if you're doing, long workloads or long multi-threaded workloads that take 10, 20, 30 minutes to complete, you might even want to rein in this overclock, because even after 5 to 10 minutes of stress testing, it was pushing the limits of my processor cooler. But nonetheless, it was stable, and the heat was kind of crazy, but you could deal with it. But that did result in the load power draw increasing to a massive 735 watts. Admittedly though, the Intel CPU wasn't too far behind, it was only about 100 watts behind with far fewer cores. But yeah, that Threadripper 2990WX is going to need a monster power supply to deal with an overclock. So you'd probably, to be on the safe side, 900 to 1000 watts, I would have thought. If you're going to be stretching the graphics card as well, of course, you're going to be adding another 100, 200 watts to that. So yeah, you need to factor in some headroom clearly. So what I wanted to do with the final few results is I've focused on the 2990WX, the 32-core Threadripper here, and what I've done is I've tweaked some settings in Ryzen Master, specifically disabling simultaneous multi-threading, so cutting back on the number of threads that are available to see if it can boost performance in those poorly performing applications, namely games and things like Adobe Premiere and HandBrake. So what I've also done here is enabled the legacy support mode, which essentially it takes the core count down to 16 or even 8. It just disables dies, and you can take the core count down to 16 or 16 cores or 8 cores depending on which game you're running. There are some older games that don't really like more than 8 cores, but for here what I've done is just basically disabled 2 of the dies, and they're the dies that don't have direct access to the rest of the system. So basically turning it into a Ryzen Threadripper 2950X, so to speak. So to start with then, there's HandBrake, and as you can see, the best result on test here is actually the 2990WX with SMT disabled. So simultaneous multi-threading disabled, so you've just got 32 cores running here, but no threads, or no added threads, should I say, thanks to the simultaneous multi-threading, and it actually gets the best result, albeit the 7980XE gets a better result once it's overclocked, but in terms of stock speed, it's now getting the best performance, and you're seeing 11 seconds shaved off that time just by disabling simultaneous multi-threading. So that's kind of interesting. It shows that clearly there's an issue here with maybe HandBrake not able to address that kind of number of threads, maybe even Windows, or just down to the fact that it's there's still issues with that CPU and Windows dealing with that kind of thread numbers. Again, you're looking at a better performance here than the Threadripper 2950X. You're looking at a sizable increase there, so that does show that the cores are still being utilised. Clearly not that much scaling going above 10 to 12 cores. 18 cores to 32 cores, so going from the Core i9 7980XE to the Threadripper 2990WX, you're going from 68 to 64 seconds, so there's clearly not much scaling there. So I'm inclined to say that there's an issue just with addressing this number of threads here, either with the CPU's internal, the actual CPU here, or just the way that HandBrake and Windows are dealing with the 2990WX. So moving on now to gaming, and I've had time just to run through Deus Ex, which is one of the CPUs that games that seems to respond to better CPU performance. And again, yeah, we're seeing a pretty significant increase in performance here. The best performance actually is in legacy mode, which drops the core count down to 16, but I believe it still has simultaneous multi-threading enabled, so you've still got 32 threads there, but you've got the minimum frame rate increasing from 39 to 57 frames a second. And if you use faster memory by doing that, you're probably going to be hitting the sort of low 60s, which is pretty much level with the Core i9 7980XE. So of course, to get that better gaming performance, what you've got to do is restart the system, and that's probably not something that a lot of people will want to do if you're, coming out of your workstation workload. You fancy, dropping into Deus Ex or another game, you're going to have to restart the system in order to get the best performance there, and there is a significant performance boost as well. Disabling simultaneous multi-threading then did have a bit of an impact. You're going from 39 to 46 frames per second on the minimum frame rate, but clearly the best option here is to drop down the cores or the core count to 16 and restart your system and to game that way. So moving on then, final benchmark I did some tweaking in was Adobe Premiere, it improved performance a little bit. Like, you go from 180 seconds with the overclocked 2990WX, and overclocked here as well. This one's actually benchmarked while I was tweaking in Ryzen Masters. So the result of 156 seconds with SMT disabled is the best I could get out of it. And again, that's still much slower than what I was seeing from the 16-core Threadrippers, the 2950X and 9250X. So clearly some other issues there. I'm not again, I didn't really have time to investigate this further. It's either due to the way the software talks to this processor, or just the way that the 2990WX is configured. So yeah, that's pretty much it from the performance numbers. And now it's time to come to some conclusions. So yeah, I think the 2990WX is maybe not quite the CPU that we thought it would be in terms of being general purpose. A lot of people out there are saying, oh yeah, I use my PC for games and content creation, and I also dabble in the odd workstation workload. I want to be able to I want to get more performance, basically. Well, if that's you, you will see more performance in your workstation workloads, but you probably won't see the kind of performance you're expecting outside of that. So in terms of a general purpose processor, I probably wouldn't use the Threadripper 2990WX. It's probably not going to, if I was using a Threadripper 1950X, the CPU you might want to upgrade to is the 2950X, but even then the performance isn't probably worth upgrading. But if you're going to go for a high-end desktop CPU system, and you are a general purpose user, you do content creation, you do gaming, really the 2990X doesn't really warrant its price tag, and also you will actually be seeing lower performance with it compared to both the 16-core Threadrippers and the Core i9 7980XE in some benchmarks. Not in all, but certainly in the ones that I've tested. Outside of these workstation workloads, performance isn't great, just because of, as I say, the way that the CPU is configured, and also due to the fact that some benchmarks, some tests, some software doesn't respond very well to 32-core, 64-thread processors. It just doesn't scale very well. So both issues with the processor there and how it's configured, and also just software not able to tap into those extra cores and threads. But that still doesn't mean that this is a bad CPU. It just means that you might not want to choose it if you're a general purpose, high-end general purpose user, or you use a whole bunch of applications, not just workstation stuff. If workstation applications like POV-Ray, Cinebench, Blender, those kind of things, if that's you and that's what you spend the vast majority of your time doing, then the 2990WX is an absolute beast. It's an absolutely fantastic processor. It's by far and away, it's faster than the Core i9 7980XE in every single workstation class benchmark that I ran, and that's particularly damning for Intel because its processor costs pretty much the same, or maybe even more, depending on where you look. So AMD has absolutely nailed this in terms of a workstation perspective, but it's maybe not as fast as we were expecting if you're a general purpose user and you use your PC for gaming and high-end content creation and that kind of thing. Now, what AMD has done with the 2950X though is offered a huge improvement in lots of areas over the first generation Threadripper, and it's now basically it's made the Core i9 7900X redundant for content creation. You just wouldn't go for that CPU for the vast majority of content creation applications, for the simple reason it costs the same pretty much, and it performs a lot worse. I mean, Adobe Premiere, for example, I'm seeing much better performance with the 2950X. HandBrake as well. So yeah, that's fairly clear cut and dried. The Core i9 7980XE though, it does offer better performance pretty much everywhere than the 2950X, but you must take into consideration here that the Intel CPU costs twice the price. And you're not seeing double the performance anywhere, I don't think. Far from it, maybe 10-20%. The only benefit it does have is that it is faster pretty much everywhere. So you're looking at much better performance in games, much better performance in content creation. So yeah, it's a difficult one because if you want that general purpose CPU, if you want your CPU to be fast in everything with doing as little tweaking as possible, but with some overclocking headroom, the Core i9 7980XE is an excellent overclocker. If that's you, then yeah, it does make a compelling case for itself despite the premium over Threadripper. But again, if you're at all concerned with value, then the 2950X is an absolutely brilliant CPU. It overclocks really well as well. I got it to 4.2 gigahertz quite easily, and using faster memory and maybe switching to legacy mode, tweaking Rise and Master, you'll be losing very little performance in games as well. So in summary then, 2990WX, great for workstation workloads, maybe not so great for gaming and content creation. Certainly, the benchmark suggests that a lot of people will have been hoping that it would have been faster in games and content creation than it actually is. Whether or not you might want to change your software in order to take advantage of it, that's probably not something that a lot of people are going to want to do. So if you've spent hundreds of hours getting used to Adobe Premiere, you're probably going to be wanting to consider the 2950X or the 7980XE from Intel for those kind of applications. The 2950X though, brilliant all-rounder, much faster both than the 7900X from Intel and also than its predecessor, the Threadripper 1950X. So that's the real star of the show here really for me. It's the 2950X, half the price of the 7980XE, but it actually snaps at its heels in a lot of benchmarks, which is absolutely incredible. Yeah, just to end on a note of thanks to AMD for sending me the press pack, which included both these CPUs. I'll be returning to some testing and hopefully building some PCs with both these CPUs over the coming weeks to investigate the situation a little further. And also to just to highlight the fact that the Threadripper 2990WX, it is a workstation-focused CPU. So if you're maybe a bit disappointed by the results today, well, it was never marketed as a gaming CPU in the same way that the 2950X is. That is a more general-purpose CPU. It's for gaming, it's for content creation, that kind of stuff. But the 2990WX, it clearly did extremely well in those workstation tasks, and that is, for those kind of people, it's a brilliant CPU, and that's really the only people that should be considering this processor as far as I'm concerned, unless you've got clear evidence that the benchmarks or software that you'll be using with the CPU will actually tap into those 32 cores and make it a worthwhile investment. So that's it for me here on YouTube, and you can see the full article, my full review of both the 2950X and the 2990WX over on Forbes using the link below. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.